The smell hit Marcus first. Cool limestone and the faint mineral tang of water that had been carving these passages for 100,000 years. He was 9 years old, holding his mother's hand too tightly as the tour guide's flashlight swept across vaulted chambers that swallowed sound. October in Kentucky meant the surface world blazed with rust and gold, but here in Mammoth Cave, the temperature never changed. The darkness never lifted. His younger sister Emily complained about the cold. His father checked the camera battery. The guide pointed to flowstone formations that looked like frozen waterfalls, her voice echoing off walls no sunlight had ever touched. Marcus let go of his mother's hand to get closer to the rope barrier, wanting to see the crystals better. When Sarah Chen turned around 30 seconds later, her son was gone. The first scream came from Emily, who noticed the empty space where her brother had been standing. Within 2 minutes, the guide had radioed park rangers. Within 20, the main entrance was sealed and a specialized cave rescue team was suiting up. Marcus Chen had vanished from a designated tourist route with 27 other visitors in a section of cave mapped since 1908, a disappearance that should have been impossible. His parents stood in the visitor center answering questions while spotlights were hauled underground and K9 units began working the passages. The cave system stretched 400 miles, most of it unexplored, but the historic tour route followed a well-lit loop that had seen millions of visitors without incident. Search teams worked in shifts, calling Marcus's name until their voices went hoarse, checking every alcove and side passage within a quarter-mile of the last known position. The search commander coordinated 12-person teams, rotating every 6 hours, each equipped with rope systems, communication devices, and thermal imaging cameras that proved useless in the cave's uniform temperature. On the second day, they found his backpack wedged in a gap between boulders near an unmapped fissure. The zipper open, a granola bar wrapper inside dated to the day of the disappearance. The discovery shifted everything. Search teams refocused on the area, establishing a forward command post 200 yards from the fissure. The opening was barely 18 inches wide, angling downward at 40 degrees into unmapped territory. Ground-penetrating sonar showed the passage continued at least 60 feet before sensors lost coherence in the fractured limestone. A juvenile-sized cave rescue specialist descended as far as anatomy allowed, calling Marcus's name into the darkness, hearing nothing but water dripping somewhere below. The specialist reported feeling air movement, suggesting the passage connected to larger chambers, but without knowing the stability or dimensions, further descent risked additional casualties. Geologists examined the formation and determined the gap had likely been widened by a recent micro-collapse, possibly triggered by foot traffic vibration or natural settling. The working theory emerged quickly. Marcus had squeezed into the fissure out of curiosity, gotten stuck or disoriented, and either fell or crawled deeper into an unmapped chamber system. By day 4, the search had expanded to include remote-operated vehicles with fiber-optic cameras, additional sonar mapping, and consultation with cavers who'd explored illegal side passages over the decades. One veteran caver produced hand-drawn maps from the 1980s, showing a network of crawlways that might connect to the area where Marcus disappeared, but the maps were imprecise and based on memory. Sarah Chen refused to leave the park, sleeping in a motel room that smelled like disinfectant and making posters, even though there was nowhere to hang them. Her husband Thomas walked the surface terrain with topographic maps, trying to identify sinkholes or secondary entrances that might connect to the underground passages. He marked 17 possibilities within a 3-mile radius, each investigated by teams who found nothing but dead ends and animal dens. Emily stopped talking, spending hours drawing pictures of her brother that grew progressively darker. The family liaison officer tried to prepare them for the likelihood that Marcus's body might never be recovered, that the cave could keep its secrets indefinitely. The media arrived on day 6, satellite trucks parked outside the visitor center, reporters asking about negligence and safety protocols. Park officials held daily briefings that offered little new information. Online forums filled with amateur theories and criticism of the rescue efforts. A psychic called the Tip Line, claiming Marcus was alive in an air pocket 200 feet down, information that wasted 8 hours of search time. On day 7, a secondary collapse sealed the fissure where the backpack had been found, tons of limestone shifting with a sound like distant thunder that echoed through multiple chambers. The incident commander made the decision everyone had been dreading. Active rescue operations were suspended. The risk to searchers had become unjustifiable. The medical examiner listed Marcus Chen as deceased. Cause of death presumed to be cave-related trauma and exposure, body unrecoverable. The family was escorted from the park in a vehicle with tinted windows to avoid the cameras. The funeral never happened, not then. Sarah couldn't accept a memorial service for a child with no body, no certainty, nothing but a backpack and conjecture. The following months were a blur of therapy appointments and investigative dead ends. For the first year, Sarah paid private cave rescue teams to continue searching during their off hours, funded by a GoFundMe that raised $62,000. Thomas went back to work as a structural engineer, but took a leave of absence after 6 months when panic attacks made it impossible to concentrate on load calculations without imagining stone crushing bone. Emily transferred schools twice, unable to escape the identity of being the girl whose brother vanished. The marriage survived, but calcified around the empty space Marcus had occupied. Conversations careful and surfaces smooth, neither parent willing to voice the thought that perhaps he'd suffered before dying alone in the dark. By year 3, Sarah had channeled her grief into advocacy, founding a non-profit focused on cave safety education and improved rescue protocols. She testified before state committees, pushing for mandatory real-time tracking on all guided cave tours, enhanced mapping of tourist areas, and better barriers around unmapped passages. Some of her proposals became law. Others died in budget negotiations. The work gave her purpose when nothing else could. Thomas found solace in numbers, spending evenings calculating probabilities, the likelihood of survival past 72 hours, the percentage of missing persons cases that remained unsolved, the statistical chance their son had somehow found a way out but couldn't find his way home. The math never added up to hope, but it filled the silence. By year 5, the foundation had grown beyond Sarah's expectations, with chapters in 6 states and a full-time staff of 3. She published a book about ambiguous loss, the psychological torture of having no body to bury, no moment of confirmed death, no closure that would allow grief to fully process. The book became required reading in some social work programs. She gave talks at conferences, her pain packaged into PowerPoint presentations and handouts. Emily graduated high school and chose a college 3 states away, the distance necessary for breathing room. She changed her major twice before settling on psychology, perhaps seeking answers to questions that had defined her adolescence. The family called every Sunday, conversations lasting exactly 20 minutes, long enough to maintain connection, but not so long that anyone had to acknowledge how fragile that connection had become. By year 7, Thomas had been promoted twice, his work ethic fueled by the need to outrun memory. He remarried 18 months after divorcing Sarah, a relationship that began as grief counseling and evolved into something neither had anticipated. Sarah didn't attend the wedding. By year 8, she'd started dating someone she'd met at a conference, a widower who understood permanent absence, if not the specific texture of her loss. Emily was in graduate school, studying trauma and resilience, her thesis examining families of the disappeared. She'd interviewed her mother twice for research purposes, the clinical distance required by academic rigor making conversation possible. By year 10, the family had achieved a fragile equilibrium, the kind that comes from learning to function around permanent damage, from accepting that some questions would remain unanswered. The commemoration service was scheduled for October 19th, exactly a decade after the disappearance. Sarah had finally agreed to a formal memorial, a way to mark the anniversary with community rather than isolation. She'd resisted for years, but her therapist had convinced her that ritual could provide what logic couldn't, a sense of completed narrative, of permission to move forward while still honoring what was lost. The church in their hometown of Lexington filled with neighbors, former classmates of Marcus, who were now 19 and unrecognizable, reporters who'd covered the story and returned for the anniversary piece, cave rescue volunteers who'd spent that awful week underground and carried their own scars from the failure. The casket was symbolic, holding only the backpack retrieved from the cave, some of Marcus's childhood drawings that Sarah had preserved in acid-free sleeves, and a letter Emily had written to her brother explaining who she'd become in his absence. Thomas sat in the third row with his new wife, the arrangement negotiated through careful emails. Emily sat with Sarah in the front pew, their hands not quite touching. The pastor was a woman who'd lost her own son to drowning and understood the specific grammar of this kind of grief. She'd just begun speaking about the mystery of suffering and the courage required to live with unanswered questions when the rear doors opened and a young man walked in. The afternoon light behind him made his silhouette difficult to read at first. Then he stepped fully into the church, and the whispers started immediately. He was skeletal, maybe 110 pounds stretched over a frame that should have carried 50 more. His skin had the pallor of something raised in darkness, faintly translucent with visible veins at the temples, and was marked with scars that suggested years of scraping against stone. Forearms cross-hatched with white lines, knuckles permanently swollen, a raised keloid across his left cheek. His hair hung past his shoulders in matted ropes that might have been blonde before darkness stripped the color. He wore clothes clearly donated or stolen, jeans held up with rope instead of a belt, a flannel shirt with mismatched buttons, boots without laces. But his eyes were what stopped conversation, pale blue like Thomas Chen's, pupils dilated so wide almost no iris showed, the eyes of something nocturnal forced into daylight. If you're following this story, hit subscribe. What happens next will challenge everything you think you know about survival. He walked down the center aisle without speaking, everyone turning to stare, moving with a strange asymmetric gait that suggested old injuries imperfectly healed. He stopped 3 feet from the symbolic casket and stared at it for a long moment before looking directly at Sarah. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse from disuse, the cadence slightly wrong, syllables taking too long to form, as if he had to remember how speech worked. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry I'm late. I should have come back sooner." Sarah's face went white. She stood, but her legs wouldn't hold her. She collapsed back into the pew, gasping. Thomas lunged forward, shouting something incoherent. Emily let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like air being forced from lungs by sudden impact. Security guards moved quickly, surrounding the young man who didn't resist or even seem surprised by the reaction. He raised his hands in a gesture that might have been surrender or simply confusion about appropriate behavior. The church erupted into chaos, cell phones raised, voices overlapping, the pastor calling for calm that nobody heard. Police were called. The young man was escorted out to a patrol car, where he sat quietly in the back seat, squinting against the afternoon sun, even with his eyes mostly closed. He was taken to University Hospital for medical evaluation and psychiatric assessment, while detectives tried to determine if this was an elaborate hoax, a mentally ill individual who'd fixated on a famous case, or something that defied rational explanation. The first step was fingerprints. Marcus Chen's prints had been on file since age 6, part of a child safety program the family had participated in. The young man's prints were degraded by years of manual labor and stone abrasion, but enough ridge detail remained for comparison. The match was conclusive. Dental records were more complicated, since 10 years of grinding calcium-poor food had worn down enamel, but the underlying structure and pattern of fillings aligned. Within 2 hours, preliminary DNA results came back from a cheek swab compared against samples preserved from Marcus's toothbrush and baby teeth Sarah had kept in a memory box. The match probability exceeded 99.9%. The dead boy was alive. The interrogation lasted 9 hours spread across 2 days, conducted in a hospital conference room with psychologists, medical doctors, law enforcement, and eventually FBI agents who specialized in missing persons cases. The young man's story unfolded slowly, his capacity for sustained conversation limited. He spoke in fragments, with long pauses between thoughts, sometimes losing track of questions mid-answer, occasionally lapsing into silence that lasted minutes before he could continue. What emerged was both simple and incomprehensible. After squeezing through the fissure, drawn by curiosity and the sound of running water, he'd fallen approximately 20 feet into an unmapped chamber, landing in a pool shallow enough to cushion the impact, but deep enough to soak him completely. The landing had dislocated his left shoulder and fractured 2 ribs, injuries he discovered later when the adrenaline faded and pain made breathing difficult. Disoriented and terrified, he'd tried to climb back up, but the passage had already partially collapsed, debris blocking the route he'd descended. He could hear voices calling his name the first day, muffled and distant through layers of stone, but his own screams went unanswered. By the second day, the voices had faded. By the third day, he understood no one was coming. He survived the first week by drinking from the underground stream and discovering that cave crickets, while disgusting, were edible. The darkness was absolute, more complete than anything most humans ever experience, the kind of darkness that after an hour makes you uncertain if your eyes are open or closed. He learned to navigate by sound and touch, mapping his immediate surroundings through repetition and memory. His chamber connected to 2 others via crawlways barely wide enough for a child's body. One led to a larger gallery where bats roosted, their guano creating a small ecosystem of beetles and millipedes. The other opened into a passage that followed the underground stream. The first month was the worst, his mind fragmenting under sensory deprivation and isolation. He talked to himself constantly, recited every song and story he could remember, screamed until his voice gave out. He carved tally marks in the cave wall with a sharp stone, marking days until the count became meaningless. His injuries healed badly without treatment, his shoulder permanently limited in range of motion. He learned to catch cave crayfish by feel, developed techniques for harvesting edible fungi that grew near water, discovered that certain areas held salamanders fat and slow enough to grab. His eyes adapted over months in ways ophthalmologists would later struggle to explain. The complete darkness triggered changes in his retinal structure, increasing rod cell density and enhancing his ability to detect the faint bioluminescence of certain bacteria and fungi. He began to see, not clearly, but enough to distinguish shapes and movement in conditions that would render most humans completely blind. His other senses sharpened correspondingly. He could detect air currents by feeling subtle temperature changes, navigate by echolocation when clicking his tongue against his teeth, identify edible organisms by smell alone. He lost track of time, but estimated seasons by water temperature and flow rates. Winter meant lower temperatures and reduced flow. Spring brought flooding that forced him to higher chambers. He learned which passages were safe and which led to sumps where the ceiling disappeared underwater. He explored methodically, always maintaining mental maps so he could return to his base chamber. In his second year underground, he found a connection to a lower level, a 50-foot vertical drop he eventually learned to climb using friction and technique born of desperation. The lower chambers held more water and more life, cave fish and larger invertebrates. He found the exit after approximately 14 months, emerging through a sinkhole 32 miles from his entry point. The calculation came later from GPS coordinates and geological surveys, but he remembered the moment clearly, crawling through a tight passage that angled upward for the first time in memory, seeing a circle of grey light above, the shock of rain on his face. He'd climbed out at dawn into a forest that seemed impossibly bright and loud and overwhelming. Every sense was assaulted. Bird calls sounded like screams. Wind through leaves was deafening. The light caused physical pain even though it was overcast. The interrogators focused on this moment. Why didn't you go home? Why didn't you seek help? His answer, repeated multiple times across hours of questioning, remained consistent but difficult for them to accept. The person who emerged through that sinkhole wasn't the 9-year-old who disappeared. 14 months alone in absolute darkness had fundamentally altered who he was. The thought of cars and buildings and crowds and noise triggered panic more profound than anything the cave had caused. He was feral, adapted to isolation, his psychology rebuilt around solitude and darkness. The surface world felt wrong, dangerous, incomprehensible. He'd lived as a drifter for 9 years, moving through rural Kentucky and Tennessee, avoiding population centers, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings, and sometimes returning to caves when the surface became too much. He stole food from unlocked cars and dumpsters behind grocery stores. He worked occasional day labor for cash, jobs that didn't require identification or social interaction, picking apples, clearing brush, loading trucks. When people asked questions, he moved on. The few times police or social workers tried to help, he disappeared into wilderness before anyone could get answers. He had no identification, no paper trail, existed in the margins most people never see. Other homeless individuals sometimes offered advice or warnings, but mostly left him alone. But guilt had grown over those years, compounding like interest on a debt. He thought about his family constantly, imagined their grief, understood the harm his disappearance had caused. He'd seen his mother's face on a missing person poster tacked to a community center bulletin board in year 3. He'd heard 2 women discussing Sarah Chen's book in a library where he sometimes spent winter afternoons. He knew they thought him dead. The knowledge created a pressure that built annually until by year 9 it had become unbearable. He'd hitchhiked back to Kentucky in October, drawn by the 10-year anniversary. He'd learned about the memorial service from a library computer where a sympathetic librarian let him use the public terminal without requiring a card. Walking into that church took more courage than anything he'd done underground. Facing other humans after a decade of avoidance felt like exposing himself to fire. The medical evaluations took 3 weeks and involved specialists from multiple institutions. His bone density was significantly reduced, consistent with years without adequate sunlight and vitamin D synthesis, putting him at high risk for fractures. His cardiovascular system showed adaptations to low oxygen environments, his hemoglobin levels elevated like someone who'd spent years at high altitude. His liver showed evidence of having processed unusual proteins and compounds for extended periods. His metabolism had adapted to sporadic nutrition and low caloric intake. His body remarkably efficient at extracting energy from minimal food sources. Dental examination revealed severe enamel erosion from acidic cave water and calcium-poor diet, with multiple cavities and 1 molar that had abscessed and healed on its own, leaving permanent nerve damage. The ophthalmological findings fascinated researchers. His pupil dilation response was significantly impaired, his eyes struggling to constrict even in bright conditions. His rod-to-cone ratio had shifted beyond normal parameters. He demonstrated functional vision in light conditions that rendered control subjects effectively blind. Conversely, normal daylight caused him genuine pain, requiring prescription sunglasses just to function outdoors. His retinal structure showed changes that some researchers speculated might be partially reversible over years, but would likely leave permanent alterations. Psychologically, he met criteria for complex post-traumatic stress disorder, severe social anxiety disorder, and what one psychiatrist termed extreme dissociative adaptation. He exhibited hypervigilance, startled responses to sudden sounds, and panic attacks in enclosed spaces with other people. His social cognition was impaired, his ability to read facial expressions and social cues significantly below age norms. He scored extraordinarily high on spatial reasoning and kinesthetic intelligence tests. His memory for routes and spatial relationships was in the 99th percentile. Brain imaging showed structural changes in his hippocampus and amygdala, consistent with prolonged stress and isolation, along with enhanced development in regions associated with navigation and proprioception. The reunion, if it could be called that, progressed in painful increments. Sarah couldn't reconcile the creature before her with the laughing child she'd lost. Every time she looked at him, she saw Marcus's eyes in a stranger's face, heard his voice filtered through a decade of trauma that had transformed everything else. She wanted to hold him, to reclaim the contact severed 10 years ago, but he flinched from touch, his personal space requirements so extensive that sitting in the same room felt like an accomplishment. Thomas tried to bridge the gap with practical matters, arranging medical care and legal documentation, coordinating with lawyers and bureaucrats, but his son's attention drifted during conversations, his eyes tracking to exits, his body language suggesting constant readiness to flee. Emily's reaction was perhaps the most complicated. She was 19 now, a college sophomore who'd built her entire adolescence around being the sister of a dead boy. Her identity had formed around absence, her relationships filtered through grief, her career aspirations rooted in understanding trauma. The brother who returned had no shared memories past age 9, no cultural touchstones, no understanding of smartphones or social media or music or movies, or any of the 1,000 small things that had changed since 2015. They'd been separated by only 4 years as children, but now felt separated by unbridgeable distance. She'd mourned him, written papers about him, built a life around his absence. His presence invalidated nothing, but somehow made everything more painful. Family therapy sessions were arranged, led by a specialist who'd worked with cult survivors and hostages reintegrating after prolonged isolation. The first session lasted 20 minutes before Marcus walked out, the room too small and too full, and his nervous system unable to process the emotional intensity. The second session was conducted outdoors in a park, which worked better but produced minimal breakthrough. The third session Marcus didn't attend, instead leaving a note saying he needed time, a word that had lost meaning during his decade underground, but somehow still governed his damaged psychology. Sarah wept through the entire session, grieving not for the son she'd lost, but for the reunion she couldn't have, mourning the fantasy of wholeness she'd unconsciously constructed during 10 years of ambiguous loss. The media frenzy was instant and global. Networks offered 6 figures for exclusive interviews that Marcus refused. Documentary crews camped outside the Chen home until police established barriers. Tabloids published wild speculation about how he'd survived, some suggesting government experiments or alien abduction or elaborate fraud, despite DNA confirmation. Mainstream outlets were only slightly more restrained, producing think pieces about human resilience and the limits of survival. Cave rescue organizations used the case to advocate for improved safety protocols and funding. Scientific journals published rapid response papers on sensory adaptation and psychological impacts of extreme isolation. Sarah's foundation saw donations triple in a month. Through it all, Marcus remained mostly silent, giving one brief statement through a lawyer asking for privacy that was universally ignored. He moved out 6 months after his return, taking a ground-floor apartment funded by his parents, selected because it had a single window he could cover completely with blackout curtains and a floor plan that allowed clear sightlines to all exits. He worked night shifts at a distribution warehouse, the solitude and darkness familiar, the repetitive physical labor soothing. His co-workers learned not to approach him directly or speak without warning. He wore sunglasses even inside and ate lunch alone in his car. Management accommodated his quirks because his work was flawless, his attendance perfect, his lack of social needs actually an asset in an environment where most people eventually cause drama. Sarah visited weekly, their relationship rebuilt from scratch, like learning a language as an adult, functional, but never quite native. They developed routines that worked for both. She'd call before arriving. They'd sit in his dimly lit living room with 6 feet between them. She'd talk about her foundation work, about Emily's graduate studies, about mundane details of her life, and he'd listen without much response, but with attention that suggested he was trying. Sometimes he'd share fragments from his years underground or his drifter period, information that emerged slowly and incompletely, his narrative capacity still limited. Progress was measured in minutes of sustained conversation, in eye contact maintained for seconds, in his ability to tolerate her presence for an hour before anxiety demanded she leave. Thomas struggled more, the engineering mindset that served him professionally, failing completely in navigating emotional reconnection with a son who was simultaneously familiar and alien. He visited monthly, conversations awkward and fact-focused, discussions about legal matters and financial arrangements that avoided anything requiring genuine emotional vulnerability. He wanted desperately to help, but had no framework for helping someone whose needs were so far outside normal parameters. His new wife encouraged him to be patient, to accept that some gaps couldn't be bridged quickly or perhaps ever. Emily wrote Marcus letters, finding that written communication worked better than face-to-face interaction, her academic training giving her tools to articulate feelings that paralyzed her in person. The legal questions were labyrinthine. A death certificate had been issued in 2016 and needed formal revocation, requiring court proceedings and multiple levels of bureaucratic approval. Social Security had stopped his number after the death declaration. Health insurance had paid death benefits that theoretically needed repayment, though Sarah's lawyer argued successfully against it. Marcus had no official education past 4th grade, no work history, no credit file, no driver's license, no voter registration, nothing that marked him as a person who'd continued existing. Lawyers spent 8 months reconstructing a legal identity, petitioning courts and agencies, producing documentation to prove the unprecedented circumstance of someone returning from official death after a decade. He attended a few GED preparation classes at a community center, but the classroom environment, fluorescent lights, close proximity to other students, the expectations of participation, triggered panic attacks severe enough to require emergency medication. He preferred to learn alone, spending hours in libraries, reading anything that caught his interest. He worked through high school equivalency materials at his own pace, eventually taking the test in a private room and passing easily despite the decade-long gap in formal education. His reading comprehension and mathematical reasoning tested at college level. His knowledge of history, literature, and current events was full of strange gaps where entire cultural movements had occurred during his absence. The cave system where he'd survived became a research priority. The National Park Service and National Speleological Society organized multiple expeditions to map the route Marcus described, his spatial memory providing coordinates and descriptions precise enough to follow even without direct involvement. He refused to return underground, but provided detailed verbal maps to experienced cavers who verified his account chamber by chamber. They found evidence of his long habitation, scratches on walls marking passages with directional symbols, areas where cave cricket populations showed signs of sustained predation, middens of crayfish shells and bat bones in specific locations, a central gallery where smooth patches on walls suggested years of repeated contact, wear patterns consistent with someone pacing the same routes thousands of times. They found the sinkhole exit, confirming its connection to the chambers Marcus had described, and verifying that a juvenile could theoretically climb out using the technique he'd outlined. They mapped over 2 miles of previously uncharted passages, a labyrinth that explained how he'd survived and why rescuers never found him. The chambers contained multiple water sources and sufficient biomass to sustain human life, barely. Geologists confirmed that the fissure collapse had indeed sealed the original entry point, and that without that collapse, rescue teams would likely have found him within days. The random catastrophe that trapped him had also inadvertently preserved his life by forcing adaptation instead of allowing passive waiting for rescue that would never have survived hypothermia. National Geographic produced a feature documentary examining the passages where Marcus had lived, sending film crews underground with specialized lighting to capture footage both beautiful and profoundly disturbing. The chambers were stunning from a geological perspective, formations millions of years old, untouched ecosystems, but the context of a child surviving there alone transformed beauty into horror. The documentary included interviews with Sarah, with the rescue coordinator who'd called off the search, with cave scientists discussing the improbability of survival. Marcus declined to participate directly, but provided a recorded statement read by an actor, his words describing the psychological dissolution of the first months underground and the strange peace that eventually came with acceptance. 1 year after his return, a research team from Johns Hopkins published a comprehensive case study examining his physiological and psychological adaptations, with Marcus's reluctant consent provided only after assurance his identity would be protected through pseudonym. The paper became one of the most cited in trauma psychology and environmental adaptation literature. Medical students studied his case as an extreme example of human plasticity. Survival instructors used it to teach about adaptation versus resignation. The ethical questions about studying someone who couldn't provide informed consent in any traditional sense sparked debates in institutional review boards nationwide. 2 years after his return, Sarah organized a small private gathering at her home, inviting only Thomas, Emily, her partner, and 2 family friends who'd known Marcus as a child and had participated in the original search. Marcus arrived 20 minutes late, his anxiety about the gathering obvious in his rigid posture and minimal eye contact. He managed 40 minutes of conversation, mostly listening, contributing single-sentence observations when directly addressed. When one of the family friends mentioned a memory from Marcus's 8th birthday, something clicked behind his eyes, recognition and grief and distance all visible simultaneously. He excused himself to the backyard, where he stood alone for 15 minutes before returning to say he needed to leave. It was progress, microscopic and hard-won, measured in minutes tolerated rather than comfort achieved. He still disappeared sometimes, gone for 3 or 4 days without communication, the pull of isolation stronger than social obligation or concern for others' worry. But he'd learned to send text messages now, brief notifications that he was okay and would return. Small acknowledgements that connection mattered even when he couldn't maintain it. Sarah had learned not to panic during these absences, to trust that he'd return when he was able. Emily agreed to meet for coffee on neutral ground in a quiet cafe that opened early when few customers were present. Their first conversation lasted 15 minutes, stilted and painful, both aware they were strangers, with shared DNA and history, but no actual relationship. They scheduled another meeting anyway, commitment to effort if not expectation of success. The question everyone asked, could he ever be normal again, gradually evolved into a different question entirely. What did normal mean for someone whose formative years occurred in absolute darkness, whose survival required becoming something other than human, whose identity was forged in isolation, so complete most people couldn't comprehend it? The therapists agreed. Recovery wasn't about returning to who he'd been, that 9-year-old boy was irretrievable, but about accepting who he'd become while building skills to exist, however uncomfortably, in the world above ground. The goal wasn't normalcy but functional adaptation, the ability to maintain employment and housing and minimal social connections, to exist without causing himself or others harm, to find moments of something resembling peace in a world that would always feel fundamentally wrong. 3 years after his return, Marcus testified before a congressional subcommittee examining national park safety standards and rescue protocols. Sarah had been invited to speak about her foundation's work, but suggested Marcus instead, believing his first-hand account would carry weight no other testimony could match. He agreed after weeks of consideration, the prospect of speaking to a room full of strangers terrifying, but the opportunity to prevent similar tragedies ultimately compelling. He spoke for 12 minutes in his characteristic monotone with long pauses between sentences, describing the fissure and inadequate barriers, the collapse that sealed his fate, the week he spent hearing searchers calling his name through stone while unable to make them hear his responses. His testimony was more compelling than any polished presentation, precisely because of its halting delivery and obvious difficulty. Committee members, who'd been checking phones during other witnesses, gave him complete attention. His description of 14 months alone in darkness, delivered without drama or embellishment, was more powerful than any emotional appeal. He concluded by stating simply that improved mapping, real-time tracking and better barriers might prevent other families from experiencing the decade of uncertainty his had endured. Within 6 months, new regulations passed. Mandatory GPS tracking on all guided cave tours in federal facilities, comprehensive mapping requirements for tourist areas with public access every 3 years, enhanced barriers and signage around any unmapped passages, improved rescue protocols, including specialized equipment pre-positioned at major cave systems. 5 years after his return, Marcus did something none of his therapists had anticipated. He requested permission to visit the sealed fissure where he'd originally disappeared, accompanied by park rangers and Sarah, who he specifically asked to come. The park service arranged a private visit before opening hours, just the 3 of them and a single ranger who maintained respectful distance. They stood near the sealed entrance in the dim tourist lighting, surrounded by the smell of limestone and earth and moisture, sounds of dripping water echoing from distant passages. Sarah hadn't been in this cave since that day, had avoided it with superstitious intensity, but she'd agreed when Marcus asked, because he'd never asked her for anything. Marcus touched the stone wall where the gap had been sealed, his fingers tracing formations with the familiarity of someone reading Braille, intimate knowledge of texture and shape. He said it was smaller than he remembered. Everything was smaller. Time and trauma had enlarged the cave in memory to proportions that didn't match reality. He stood there for several minutes in silence, while Sarah watched, uncertain what this meant or whether she should speak. Finally, he turned to her and said, "Thank you for not giving up, for searching, for continuing to believe when belief made no sense." She wanted to embrace him but knew better, so she just nodded and said she'd never stopped looking, even when everyone else had. They stayed 10 minutes before the enclosed space triggered Sarah's anxiety, the walls pressing in, panic rising until she had to leave. Marcus followed her to daylight without complaint. As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah noticed her son's hand was shaking, tremors visible even from several feet away. She recognized it as his stress response, the autonomic reaction to overwhelming stimuli. She moved closer and asked if he was okay. He said he would be, he just needed time to process. She did something she hadn't attempted in 5 years. She reached out and took his hand. For 30 seconds he allowed the contact, his grip tight enough to hurt, his hand cold despite the warm October air. Then he pulled away, but the gesture had been made and survived. Above them, the autumn leaves were turning the same rust and gold they'd been the day a 9-year-old boy let go of his mother's hand and stepped into darkness that would consume a decade. The world had continued spinning through impossible survival and painful reconstruction, through grief that transformed into advocacy, through a family splintered and partially reformed into something new and strange. Marcus would never be the son who disappeared. That laughing child ceased to exist the moment the fissure collapsed. Sarah had finally stopped trying to resurrect him, finally accepted that grief wasn't about recovering what was lost, but about learning to live with the empty space it left behind. The young man beside her was damaged and strange, marked by scars visible and invisible, functionally disabled in dozens of ways most people would never understand. But he was stubbornly, improbably alive. He'd survived what should have killed him and was learning slowly to survive what came after. Some wounds don't heal so much as transform into scars, visible, permanent, but no longer actively bleeding. Some disappearances end not with recovery, but with discovering that the person who returns is someone new, carrying pieces of who they were, like fragments of bone knit imperfectly back together. They stood together in the parking lot for a moment, mother and son, connected by biology and history and the peculiar intimacy of shared catastrophe. Then Marcus said he needed to go, his tolerance for proximity exhausted, and Sarah let him leave without protest. She watched him walk to the donated car he'd finally learned to drive, moving with that asymmetric gait that suggested old injuries and altered proprioception. He drove away slowly, still uncomfortable with speed and traffic, and she stood in the October sunlight feeling something that wasn't quite happiness, but perhaps was the next best thing: acceptance. The miracle she'd prayed for during those first awful weeks had arrived a decade late and in a form unrecognizable from what she'd imagined, but it was perhaps the only miracle she'd ever really needed. Her son was alive. Everything else was just details to be worked out over whatever time they had left.